there. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Stefanie Schneider, who is my colleague at the Open University. She's a lecturer in intercultural communication at the School of Languages and Applied Linguistics, where she currently creates and designs short courses in intercultural communication in professional contexts. She also teaches business communication as well as language and culture. Together with Tony Johnston Young, Sarah Ganassin, Steve Walsh, and Alina Schartner, Stefanie has just published the book Intercultural Challenges for the Reintegration of Displaced Professionals, responding to language learning needs of refugees in Europe, which came out with Routledge this year. In her doctoral thesis, which she submitted to Newcastle University in early 2020, Stefanie presented an interactionist and conversation analytical account of question and answer sequences in oral financial results presentations in business settings. And I believe her talk today, entitled A Conversation Analytical Lens on Expressing Doubt and Skepticism in Professional Settings, comes out of your PhD work. So without further ado, over to you, Stefanie, and we are looking forward to a rich talk and a wonderful lively discussion later on. Please use the chat if you have any questions along the way, just to help yourself remember your own questions, or to just ask questions as we go along. And please remember that we are recording this talk, and we will so please please be respectful to everybody. And if you don't want to be seen on screen, then please don't switch on your cameras. Okay, over to you, Stefanie, please.
Thank you very much, Jesper. Yeah, as you just said, today I'm going to be talking about work I've done before. I've worked on an Erasmus-funded project for the reintegration of highly skilled refugees. So this has been, it has been a few years, but I would like to go back into this because it was part of my PhD thesis and I worked on it for a few years. So the purpose of this talk today is that I'm talking about one of the chapters that I've written for this, that I'm planning to develop further. And the focus, wait 1 second. Yeah, there we go. So the talk outline for today is I'm going to talk a bit about one specific professional context, and I'm linking what I've worked on there, or I'm relating this to, I don't want to say similar professional context. I will tell you why I chose the settings that I did, which I'll discuss at the end of the talk, but I'm interested in how delicate social actions are performed in professional settings, and with a focus on financial disclosure. I know that financial disclosure isn't necessarily something that we're all familiar with, especially with us all being linguists. So I'm going to try my best to explain why this is actually a really interesting setting and why it's worthwhile studying. And I'm going to say a few words about why I chose to study it using conversation analysis and why it, what it can contribute to the field, because it is a field that's still very much dominated by approaches from economics and finance. So what does a microanalytic approach have to do there? And is it actually something that people in the field are interested in? Luckily, they are. And I'm going to say a few things about how I understand being skeptical or expressing doubt. So how do we define this within conversation analysis, or the CA or EMCA community? And then I'm going to show you transcripts from 3 different professional settings. Okay, so first of all, don't be alarmed. This is not going to be abstract and boring and theoretical. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the context that I worked on for my PhD thesis. So I was interested in how information disclosure was negotiated in public. So we will all have heard of the financial crisis, and this was exactly also why I thought this might be quite interesting, because I wanted to know what has changed. Has something changed? And is this something that we could analyze with coming from a background of communication and applied linguistics? So on this on this diagram here by White House, you can see the different players that are involved in financial disclosure. So we can see the investors and the companies on opposite ends, and we can see how information is filtered for the investors. So it is obviously done by the company through public relations, and if you are an investor with a considerable amount of money, through investor relations. And you also get your information as an individual or as a company who invests from financial journalists, rating agencies, and financial analysts. So I was interested in financial analysts because, unlike investor relations and public relations, they're not supposed to be biased. And they're also seen as being the more reliable, and in terms of analysis, producing the more richer documents for investors, as apparently the financial journalists and their insights have been on the decline. And I was interested in how they perform a very difficult role, because they have to, they are representing their clients, which are investors, when they are negotiating information disclosure with the companies, but they also heavily rely on the companies for information disclosure. So we have these very public settings, because since the Enron scandal of 2002, financial regulation has been changed across the world, in the States and also here. So value relevant information has to be made public or has to be disclosed to all investors at the same time. So private investors shouldn't be at a disadvantage. So technically, all the interesting conversations between financial analysts and companies should happen on a stage, on a public stage. They shouldn't happen behind closed doors. That would be insider trading. So I was interested not so much into the written documents that are compiled after these meetings. I was interested in how they talk to each other, and how this, I cannot really make any inferences about how investors make their decisions based on these interactions. I was first and foremost interested in, okay, so how do financial analysts behave? Because they cannot be overly critical, probably, because if they might say the wrong thing, or they might humiliate corporate leaders on a public stage, that might limit their access in the future. Because there are studies that suggest that not just the public interactions take place, there's also a lot of private interactions taking place, not necessarily between analysts and corporate leaders, but between the investor relations department and financial analysts. So there is a fine balance to be struck between maintaining access and having more access to information, first-hand information, and between producing reliable reports for investors based on which they can make decisions which lead to profitable investments. So they need a good relationship to the companies, and they also obviously need to do a reliable job in producing reliable documents for the investors. So how does that look like? So my starting point was to see, not to say, well, conversation analysis can answer all of your questions. It was more, so what's going on in the field at the moment? What are the opinions here? And maybe my small scale study can side with one camp or the other. So the question at the basis of this, before I go into delicate social actions, is, okay, so how rigorous are financial analysts? So how likely is it that they express doubt and that they take on maybe even a watchdog role, which was assigned to financial analysts post-financial crisis? You know, you are the ones understanding what's going on. You are the ones who should see when something's going wrong, besides auditors. So do you hold them accountable in conference calls, for instance, which is where financial results are presented, followed by a Q&A? So there's studies that say, well, they are rigorous. So if there's unexpected bad news, we can see that there's increased rigor. So there are, for instance, more negative analyses. The more improvised form of language use in the Q&As shows that they are more direct in the documents that they are writing. So there seems to be something more spontaneous, less rehearsed going on. And it's also been shown fairly recently that analysts, so in these Q&As, analysts are selected to ask questions in public following a financial results presentation. So it's been shown in a data set from Brazil, which to my delight is what I found in my data set here in Britain as well, is that analysts in a way work together. So when an analyst asks a question and it's not fully answered, they either come up with a follow-up question, or other analysts then say, well, going back to the question that Jonathan asked earlier, so they almost work together to receive the answer that they want. So there seems to be some genuine work going on there in these Q&As to receive information that's relevant that the management might not necessarily want to give. On the other hand, however, we have evidence that there's barely any sell or hold recommendations. So if you ask a financial analyst who is an expert in a certain field if you should invest, it's very likely that they will say yes, and they will give an optimistic outlook, even if retrospectively we see that there's that performance has been weak. And a breakthrough finding actually was by Mayu in 2008, which showed that if analysts were writing or giving negative forecasts, they weren't selected to ask questions anymore in these Q&As. So that shows us a negative forecast, even if it's likely to be true, means you have less access to the management. So there is definitely a balance to be struck here. And another question I found very interesting that I tried to answer or respond to in my PhD thesis, but not so much in the talk today, is what our conference called only performative, because there are a lot of analysts that have been interviewed who claim that it doesn't really make any sense for them from a professional point of view to take part in a Q&A, because what you ask is public. So if you have a hunch that you think nobody else has, you share it with everyone. And if you are really off track and you have the wrong idea, you might be ridiculed in front of everyone. So they say there's more risks involved than there's benefits. So I hope in this very short summary, I have shown that there's a lot of constraints in place here. And conversation analysis allows me to look at how financial analysts construct their own professional identity, their own professional role through these interactions. Now, CA requires me to work with natural occurring data, which I have. Conference calls are webcast online, so I can see the financial results presentation, which I don't really understand, but I can see the Q&A as well. And I can even get transcripts that I can then work with. I mean, they're tidied up. And I can see, theoretically, how the talk is sequentially, I assume talk is sequentially organized. So an action causes a reaction. I have adjacency pairs. I have a question, I have an answer, I have a follow-up question, I have another answer. Unfortunately, in this data set, the next turn proof procedure doesn't always work, which we use in CA, which means because it's an emic approach, when somebody says something, I cannot just assume this is what they mean. I only focus on how the participants of the interaction orient to what has been said. So how I interpret what's going on should not matter. I should only include what I can see on the transcript. That is very tricky here, because I often get a rehearsed question and a relatively rehearsed answer. So two long turns that don't necessarily fit, but I guess that's a finding in itself. But I also get this. So this is just an example. I don't have any sound bites for this. It's just to show you how these interactions can look like. So here, this is just, I mean, you can maybe revisit this if you're interested in it later, since it's being recorded. Maybe you recognize the name Antonio Osorio. He's just been in the news because he's not with Lloyd's anymore. He's now lost his job with Credit Suisse because he broke quarantine rules. So, and here he's making fun of an analyst. But you can see there is a lot of potential here for looking at interesting interactions where things happen that are really, that you wouldn't expect in a Q&A, where you ask a single question and you receive a single answer. The analysts break with this, and we can see here the management does too. So in order to answer the question of how analysts walk this fine line, I wasn't interested in how they celebrate successes of the company. I wanted to see how delicate social actions are carried out. So how do analysts address it if there has been misinformation, or if they can spot that information that was given contradicted information that was given in another place, or contradicted their own analysis? So how would they approach it if something doesn't seem right and they don't think that the management has been truthful? So with CA, that means that I'm interested in unspoken rules that are only made explicit through talk. And I used definitions and concepts from CA for this. So as you can see here, skepticism is understood as doubt concerning the accuracy or the truthfulness of a statement. And in CA, we find this in a transcript through either disaffiliative action or disalignment. These are often used interchangeably, but they mean slightly different things. So disaffiliation means that I'm breaking with the stance. So for instance, I'm challenging what you're saying. Or disalignment is I'm breaking with the suggested structure of an interaction. As an example, here you can see something that was unfortunately one of the first interactions that I came across that gave me a completely wrong idea about what my data set would be like. My data set was the quarterly results presentations of 6 major British investment banks. And this is what an interaction that's as closely as it gets to an open confrontation. And we can see both disaffiliation and disalignment here. So the interruption of the financial analyst, whose role it goes, is an example for disalignment, because that is not the suggested structure. You're not supposed to interrupt the manager when he gives an explanation, especially not with a disaffiliative action, which is here a very clear disagreement. So Andy Halford says that they don't need to publish certain numbers, and then Ronan says, well, everybody else does. And he does this twice. Sorry to be a pain, but everybody else does this. And Andy Halford, who's the manager of Standard Chartered, cannot really disagree, because that's true. So here we can see disaffiliation and disalignment. So based on this, I expected some challenging, criticism, disagreement, and I found almost none of it, which in itself is a finding. But I will show you what I did find. So in order to get an idea of what the setting is going to be like, I wanted to first look at other settings where I could expect doubt in questions. So where I expected the person to ask a question who might see themselves to be a watchdog, and who are likely to express doubt in a single question. So not in a longer conversation, but they have a very strict turn-taking system, which is Q&A. So where else do I have a Q&A? Where else is it public? And where else are the difficult questions being asked? And I found at the time that the most influential study like this is by Clayman Heritage about questioning presidents. So it's about political press conferences. And I also looked at court interactions. I'm fully aware that the professional roles here are entirely different, but I was still interested in how is expressing doubt carried out in those settings, and what does it tell me that in the setting that I'm looking at, it's done so differently, if it is done differently. So for the remaining time, and I think it's 1:30, so I think I have maybe 10-12 minutes left. I'm going to show you how doubt is expressed in these 3 settings and what conclusions I drew from this for the setting that I'm interested in. And I'm very happy, by the way, if you are familiar with studies on different professional settings, to give me your input and to show me, to tell me what else might be relevant to this. And I'm also very happy to hear alternative interpretations to this from mine, because I'm fully aware that CA thrives in data sessions where you look at transcripts together and where you analyze it together. So it's not that I'm presenting something to you that I think is already perfect and complete. So just to start with questioning witnesses in public inquiries, which is an article written by Sidnell in 2010, which was published in a book that focused entirely on how questions are asked, which was beautiful for my PhD. So I was interested in this particular setting because questions are overtly information seeking, but actually hold a witness accountable, especially in a cross-examination. Not necessarily when you're questioning your own client, but if you are questioning the party that you want to prove is guilty of something. So I thought this could be somewhat related to the context that I'm looking into, because there are very strict rules that need to be followed. So how is this carried out? And we can see here, I've included two examples from the courtroom. One is a yes or no question, which Sidnell argues is often used to establish knowledgeability. So it's basically the groundwork that you need to lay in order to really nail them down on what you want to say they must have known or must have done or must have been aware of. So the first question is, did you know why the account was being split? What did you know? And then in the second one, we can see how the attorney here is then holding the witness accountable. Now, why would you give Mr. Finkelstein what you called a complete answer that would not include that fact? So this is not an information seeking question, and usually it's one to hold the witness accountable by. And he argues that these questions are usually started with why or how. He also says that it was interesting that sometimes questions weren't clear interrogatives, but they were responded to as if they were. And you are not supposed to hold the witness accountable. You're supposed to ask information-seeking questions. So he was also asking, why are sometimes these actions sanctioned and why are they not sanctioned? This is not really relevant to what I'm doing, but just to show you what he found. So he claims that holding the witness accountable through, be it in a question or not actually technically a question, is sanctioned if it doesn't happen in the first position, but in the third position. So when it's basically a comment on the answer of a witness. So here, I think in line 10, we can see you just forgot to mention it the last time. That is being sanctioned, and then it's okay to turn this into a question. So I take it we are to believe today that you just forgot about it the last time. So this is an interrogative, but it's still an ironic statement, but in this format, it's not being sanctioned. So I was interested in this concept of it dressing something as information seeking, but in fact holding somebody accountable. And I wondered, is this happening in financial disclosures as well? And another thing that I was interested in was the way Clayman and Heritage studied how the questioning of presidents changed throughout time. And they argue it has become more hostile. So I was interested to see in how that was done, and if any of these markers that they have found, if I could find them in my data set as well. So they said one sign is the initiative of the journalists. So we can see questions are more complex. They have cascades of questions, so lots and lots of questions in the same turn, and follow-up questions, which increases the pressure for getting the answer that you want. Because if you know beforehand that there won't be a follow-up question, you can evade something quite openly. But if you know that if you do not give the answer that the person questioning you feels entitled to receive, there will be a follow-up question. So this idea of contingency and entitlement was also very prevalent in my research as well. So we have an example here, and again, I'd say in the interest of time, I'm not going to read all of them out, but if you would like to revisit it, just look at the recording and pause it at this point, or just check the references and you'll find all the data in there. They're all from the same paper. Another one that was very relevant for me was directness. So the use of referencing frames as a tool to mitigate a question. So in their study, they found that this is happening less when questioning presidents. So for instance, if you say, "Sir, could you tell us?" you're insinuating that there's maybe a limited ability to give the answer. So you could also say, you could appeal to the willingness to give an answer and use modal verbs accordingly as well. And with phrasing these questions like this, you can offer the person you're asking a question a way out. So no, I can tell you, I can't for reason X, Y, Z. But if you already signal in the question that you're aware that there are constraints, it does offer, or it facilitates rejecting giving an answer. There's also self-referencing frames. So could I ask a question, which is almost like asking for permission. Then they furthermore found an increase in assertiveness. So a preface tilt, that was also very relevant for me. So when you preface a question, when you prepare it, you can already really clearly signal what answer you expect to hear, or what answer you think is morally right to give. And this has been done, this is increasingly being done. Negatively formulated questions are a good example as well. So if you would say to me, the presentation should answer now, should finish now, shouldn't it? Then I know what your stance is. You're revealing it to me that way. Hostility, open critique, and disagreement. So I'm just going to read these ones out because these are quite most closely linked to expressing skepticism. So this is really, again, holding the person you're asking a question accountable for something. So, Mr. President, you've mentioned your interest in easing tensions, and you've said you hope the Nicaraguan proposals will have that effect. Now, your spokesman has said that the 4,000 troops that you're planning to send down there will ... have standing orders to defend themselves if they're fired upon. How does that help to ease tensions? So we have a very clear preface tilt here, and it's a very open critique. So, and again, this feeds into Heritage's work of saying that the questions starting with how and why usually hold the person that the question is for accountable. So I was interested what I could find if I would find questions like this, which are not mitigated at all, or what type of mitigation strategies I would find in my data set. And now we're coming to my talking point, and I see we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm just gonna try to sum this up, probably without playing the audio. I have 2 examples here, and you can see on the transcript they are a bit more detailed, which you already saw at Sidnell. So there's intonations and pauses on here exactly for being able to analyze it also when you do not have the audio. And this is an example for the type for the pattern that I found, which is called a puzzled analyst. So they have a question and it's massively mitigated and they reach out for help. So I'm just gonna read out the relevant part. Or can I? So he says, I'm just gonna read it out. So, good morning. I just wanted to follow on non-core actually, please. So he says what he wants to discuss. I had 2 questions and I've only have the first one on here. This was the first one on cost line. Jonathan was asking about revenues, but you've obviously given guidance. Today on costs, I just want to get to grips with whether your exit rate guidance should be extrapolated into 2015. Because if so, when it looks like consensus is too low on cost for 2017, this worry around stranded costs and non-cost seems to be increasing with this guidance. And I wonder if you could calm my fears over that. So I was looking for disaffiliative actions and disalignment. And what I found here was cooperation. So in the question, we have mitigation, we have self-referencing frames, We have alignment in the sense of that the analyst appeals to a shared interest in company performance. And even though the cause for doubt here is because if so, it looks like consensus is too low, the focus of the question is not on this discrepancy, it is on reaching out to calm their fears. And later on, as you can see, there's 10 lines missing because the second question is still coming. The CEO of Barclays says, "I'll do my best to, Manus, to allay your fears." So he even picks up this phrase, which again emphasizes cooperation. So this is almost appealing to the source of the information to clarify what is going on, and it's not to hold them accountable. And it's fairly, because of the self-referencing frames, there's only a small degree of directness, really, or it is highly indirect. And I've seen this across my data set quite a lot, that these difficult questions are managed through affiliative actions, often also, for instance, through laughter. And that doesn't mean that financial analysts present themselves in a self-depreciating way. Oh,
the next question.
Unfortunately, this is quite long, but I think I would still like to play it. So what's happening here is that we find that the analyst here takes a slightly different approach. So in their question, they are presenting themselves as highly knowledgeable, and they're definitely not scared. I'll play this to you, and I've highlighted a few things here because I was interested in particular in the use of contrast structures, because one of my arguments in my thesis is that this offers a way out of confrontation. And I've marked them here with 3 different arrows, and I've underlined the 2 questions. So you can see most of this bulk of talk is a preface, a question preface, but there's a lot of work that is being done in that question preface. And based on everything that I just threw at you in the last 15 minutes, I'm just going to play this to you and then tell you afterwards what I thought of it. Just a word of caution, I have not included the answer to this. I'm going to tell you what the style of the answer was like, but for the interest of time, otherwise the recording would just be much too long. It is already 2 minutes. And I know it sounds like there will be just a lot of financial jargon, but I hope, usually I would play this to you multiple times so you can start ignoring it. But yeah, just focus on how the question is phrased.
Yeah. Let's go over there, back there.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Thank you. Good morning. It's Arturo de Frias from Santander. 2 questions, please. One on the dividend cut and one on the size of the, future profitability of the investment bank, because you have made it clear that the size is not going to change much going forward. On the dividend, you tell us that you're cutting the dividend because you want to fund potential losses from an accelerated disposal of non-core. But at the same time, you say that you expect most of those disposals to take place in 2016. So I guess most of the losses will take place in 2016. I fully understand that you would cut dividend 1 year. I fully understand that you would cut the dividend of 2016 to face those losses. But why you have decided to cut the dividend of 2 years in one go, if you really expect that most of the downsizing is going to take place in year 1? On the investment bank, you're saying very clearly that you don't expect the investment bank size or RWAs to change much, excluding probably Basel IV. But the fact is that, as several of my colleagues asked or mentioned, the ROTE of the IB is still 6%, which is well below the rest of core, cost of equity, any measure. So if you think that the size of the investment bank is the correct one, it probably implies that you think that the ROE is going to go back to normalized or reasonable levels relatively fast. So my question would be, is that what you think? You think that the ROT of the investment bank will go back to cost of equity in, let's say, 1 or 2 years? Because if not, I guess, as Tom mentioned just before, it would be easier to reduce the investment bank, or it would make more sense to reduce the investment bank than to sell down Africa.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh. No. Okay. Right. So this is a really long turn, which is not very usual for CA. I'm aware of that, but I chose this one because it shows you multiple examples of contrast structures that I was particularly interested in, because I wanted to see, okay, so what are the analysts contrasting here? What is the preface achieving, and what is the actual question about? So we have 2 long prefaces here in which the analyst reports what the company has said. And so the first one is, you tell us X, but at the same time you say Y. This is not treated as a problem. We can hear in the contrast structure, or because a contrast structure is used, that there's a mismatch, something doesn't fit, but the speaker doesn't treat it as a problem. It's more the basis for their own assessment that they are trying to make. So the focus is on the task at hand, that they want to produce a document that can inform investors, and they insinuate that they cannot do this with conflicting information without holding the company accountable for publishing conflicting information. And the first question to me comes the closest to what we've seen in the courtroom. It's a why question. So why have you decided to do that? When clearly you expect that most downsizing is here. So again, there's a mismatch, but he also immediately moves on to the next question. So there's no explicit holding accountable, and the answer also doesn't treat it that way. The answer just says, yeah, you're right, that's what we're expecting, and that's the end of it. So it's not treated as an issue by both sides. But the phrasing of the question clearly implies, again, that there's a mismatch, but the mismatch is not used to explicitly criticize or challenge the management. And then we have another one, you're saying very clearly, but the fact is that, which shows high certainty, high knowledgeability, and it demonstrates that the financial analyst positions himself and his colleagues in a place where they are difficult to deceive. Because even though they were given certain information, they know that it's actually something else. But again, this is treated as something normal. It's normalized. It's not treated as an issue because the question focuses on something else. It's, I want to know what you're thinking because I need to write the report. So the focus is again on, I orient to you as a source of information, not as a source of information that owes me anything from a moral standpoint. So this is a really long turn, and there's much more to unpack here for sure, but for the sake of time, I won't. So what are my conclusions? I found, so how was doubt or skepticism expressed? And what does the way delicate actions are performed tell us about these professional roles? So altogether, I concluded that financial analysts do not construct themselves as watchdogs. They do not position themselves in a way that they can hold, or that they're interested in holding the management accountable, even if there's clear issues that they demonstrate that they're aware of. But there's no comment, there's no complaint, there's no reproaching on it, there's no disalignment. More the opposite. What I did find a lot was attempts to align and to undertake affiliative actions, as in emphasizing, for instance, a shared interest. And the design of both the questions and answers overall, to me, demonstrated cooperation between the two and solidarity, and not the institution that represents investors, which are regularly deceived. There are plenty of studies that show how retrospectively we know false information was given, and what linguistic features might give that away. So we must not forget that financial analysts go into these meetings expecting that they might be deceived. So that is the elephant in the room. And the way it's dealt with is that it's not problematized. So yeah, there are a couple of questions that are open here that can be asked. So for instance, are there certain question types that make it more likely that information is shared? And the status of the financial analyst, does this have an impact on how information is shared or when more specific information is given? And also very interesting would be to really sit down with somebody from the field of finance and say, okay, this question is performative because nobody needs to answer this. We all know this. It's just so I can keep my slot in the Q&A. Or are there actually tricky questions and are the answers to them differently? But this is a whole other can of worms because I want to do CA. And it's very difficult to do to claim that I have an emic perspective when I take all of this into account. But yes, thank you very much. And yeah, if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Stefanie, for this really rich talk. And I know that there's so much more to unpack.